Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to thank you all for joining us for today's EDTalks. We were set to come together last March. We weren't able to do that, but we never lost connection. Our community has stayed actively engaged with us, continuing to support our students and our families. And so we're just glad that we could come together, even if it is virtual at this time. So our theme for today is all about moving forward, going beyond the school walls. And my name is Jessica Weaver, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Executive Officer at Communities and Schools of San Antonio. And I just want to thank all of our friends, our board members, our funders, supporters that are with us here today and have continued with us through these challenging times. If you are new to our CIS community, we want to welcome you. We're glad to have you here to join us for today's discussions. So a quick housekeeping comments. So all of our guests have entered in as a listen-only mode. However, that does not mean we don't want you to join in on the conversation. So we encourage you to use the chat feature, share comments throughout the program. Near the end of the session, we'll have a brief question and answer session, and you can submit your questions by using the Q&A feature, and we will get to as many as we can. So we want you to be engaged in the conversation. So we hope that you will use all these features. So reality is that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought hardship into our communities. But when we had to change the way we work, the way we educate our kids, the way we even shop for our groceries, we all adapted and we came together. We saw our community of support rally around our students and their families. As many of our families were already facing financial struggles, they were just heightened by the pandemic. We saw goodness from our neighbors and our partners, and we saw a path forward. So we went beyond the school walls to provide for our students. We want to continue the work that we are doing and that we started to do. As we transition into this post-pandemic era where school is both virtual and in person, we want you to be part of the conversation as we develop a way forward. And so I just want to personally thank all of our panelists and our guests for taking time with us to have these important conversations today. So I'd like to take this time to introduce you to our moderator for this afternoon, which many of you already know as Rey Saldana. So Rey, welcome. And before I hand it over to you, Rey, I'd like for our audience to hear a little bit more about your background. So Rey Saldana is a CIS alumnus whose journey from a former student supported by CIS San Antonio to a national leader of communities in schools. Rey's journey sends an inspiring message to young people nationwide about the power they have to write their own success story. And I've actually heard from some of our students who say that they have been inspired by hearing Rey's journey. The son of immigrants who come to this country from Mexico, Saldaña was born and raised on the south side of San Antonio and is a product of Title I Texas public schools in South San Antonio ISD. He's a proud first-generation American and first in his family to graduate from college. Before Saldaña became the national leader for communities and schools, he served as a regional advocacy director for Raise Your Hand Texas Foundation and the chair of the San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Agency, VIA. Prior to that, he successfully served 4 terms on the San Antonio City Council, where he was first elected at age 24, becoming the youngest council person in that city's history. During his 4 terms, Saldaña focused on helping to meet the needs and harness the skills of young people and working families in his community. In recognition of his accomplishments and enduring interest in the mission of communities and schools, in 2017, Communities and Schools invited Rey to serve on the CIS National Board of Directors, making him the first alumni to join the board. Thank you, Rey, for your inspiration and your willingness to join us today. And I'm so grateful that we work together on the CIS mission to surround students with a community of support, empowering them to stay in school and achieve in life. Thank you, Rey.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for the introduction. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today in this virtual space. This could be your lunch hour, you could be between Zoom meetings at work, and that you are spending time with us to talk about what is the reimagining of our community, the reimagining of public education to truly meet the needs of our students is so pivotal and critical and important to the theme that we're discussing today, and that I'm delighted to be able to moderate with the panelists that we have being represented today. So first, let me thank, of course, our CEO, Jessica Weaver. As some of you know, or maybe you are getting to know Communities in Schools, we are a national nonprofit all across the country. We are in 25 states, in 120 sites, just like CIS of San Antonio. And the great thing about getting the opportunity to see at the national level the work of Communities in Schools is to really lift up and say how great it is to know that San Antonio, CIS of San Antonio, is leading the pack. And you could say that's because I'm a biased observer. You could say it's because I'm a product of CIS of San Antonio program, but it is truly something I am hearing and seeing all across the network, that what starts here in CIS of San Antonio really does create a ripple effect across the country and the communities that we are serving, as diverse as rural Georgia to West Virginia to Chicago to LA. The work of Communities in Schools is constantly being adapted to meet the needs not only of our students, but all of those things that we just can't control, not the least of which has been the pandemic that has shut down schools and forced Communities in Schools to ask ourselves, how do we operate when schools are shut down? If we are Communities in Schools, the question now is, what does it look like to be beyond school walls, which is the theme of the conversation here today. I want to start the moderation by just getting a sense of the folks who are in the room. So I have a poll question that I think is going to be set up for those who are joining us today. And the question is very simple. Is this your first time attending a CIS event? Please answer yes or no. Let us know about the familiarity you have with the organization. Maybe you're a longtime friends of CIS, like the organization who's helping us put this event on today, or you're a board member. And for you, I want to say, for our board members, I want to say thank you as well for joining us. So go ahead and answer. And in a few seconds, I think I'll have the results of that so we can get a sense of who's in the room. But great. For the most part, we have a lot of folks who, for CIS, this is not new to them. For some, you're joining us for the very first time. Welcome in. And let me start here. Because you're joining us for your lunch hour, and I know that this is like caldo weather in San Antonio. And so the fact is we've made it to the fall season of 2020, which means we're on the back end of this crazy year. But I will say this, we did not come this far to only come this far. The fact of the matter is we need to understand, and I'm so grateful that we have the people who we have on the call today. We need to understand how we learn from this moment. It's not enough, and I've heard this because I've had the opportunity to sit on panels and talk to other leaders all across the country, is that what does it truly look like to not go back to normal? Because when we think about the spheres of influence, you as a participant going back to your business, going back to your school district, going back to your position of leadership, is what can I truly do to make sure that we are not going back to a normal that hasn't worked for the majority of our young people? It's something that I echo when I discuss this point and echo the voice and the words of one of our panelists, Pedro Martinez, who has talked a lot about the fact that schools as it was built was not working for some of our students who were living through concentrated generational poverty. And when you think about the basic architecture of school, what we're saying at Communities in Schools is that a school that is not built with integrated student supports or a site coordinator on site is not a school that is built justly, because we know what happens to students who fall through the cracks. And if we don't have systems in place to create a new normal, then we're truly not living up to the expectations of this moment. So grateful that we've got panelists today who are going to talk to us a little bit about what they're doing in their spheres of influence, whether that's at the city, the state, the school district, or zoomed into the site coordinator level. So with that, let me now introduce our panelists who are joining us today. And I hope to just give me a minute or two to read through their bios, because I want you to get to know who these folks are when I describe positions of leadership and their spheres of influence. Let's start with my councilwoman, Dr. Adriana Rocha Garcia. Dr. Rocha Garcia is a lifelong resident of San Antonio. Adriana Rocha Garcia was raised in and continues to call the Southwest of San Antonio home. Dr. Garcia has a passion for working with organizations that help San Antonio's most underrepresented demographics, and we've seen that already in the year and a half that she's worked on the city council. She was raised in a Spanish-speaking household to parents with a first and second grade Mexican education. She became the first in her family with a college degree and later became one of the first Latinas to earn a PhD in advertising from UT's prestigious Moody College of Communications. One of the more important titles that she and I share that I'm really proud of is that she is also an alumni of Communities and Schools programs here in San Antonio. And currently she serves, as many of you all know, as the City Councilwoman in District 4. So Councilwoman, thank you again for joining us. Now, shifting over, we have Jennifer Prudeaux, who is our site coordinator. And Jennifer has worked in social work field for more than a decade and has spent the last 3 years with Communities and Schools at Dory Miller Elementary. She was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas. She is a product of SAISD, graduate of, let me get this right, JT Brackenridge Elementary, Tafoya Middle School, Lanier High School, absolutely proud of the West Side. And today we are proud that she is a CIS site coordinator, and she helps students by offering emotional support in times of need, facilitates social emotional programming to promote growth, and ensures that families have the most basic needs that need to be met. She's passionate about helping children and families, especially in the East and West Side communities. Jennifer, thank you for joining our panel as well. And finally, to round out the trio of panelists that we will have joining us today is Pedro Martinez. Now, Pedro joined SAISD as superintendent in June of 2015, bringing to the district, as many of you all know, a laser-like focus on improving academic achievement. As a data-driven leader with in-depth knowledge of academic reform strategies, he firmly believes students will rise to the challenge with proper supports, that by setting the bar high, many more students will demonstrate the aptitude and the aspirations to perform at higher levels and be well prepared for college and career. And under his leadership, the district is seeing improved graduation rates and college going rates, as well as an expanded access to rigor for the curriculum. Mr. Martinez has more than 20 years of experience in the private, nonprofit, and public education sectors. And now I can say that we've both now shared a boss. One of my board of directors is one of Pedro's former bosses when he was in Chicago, which is former Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, who sits on our national board. And we're just grateful now to have such a profound guest speaking to the levels of which we are able to actually turn the keys to affect some change in this moment that we're living through. So let me get started. I want to start with Councilwoman Adriana Rocha Garcia. And Councilwoman, this is a question that I know is very personal to you, but the pandemic has impacted a number of families in our communities, including your own. So whether people have lost their jobs, they lost opportunities, or sadly lost loved ones, can you speak to what resources and support systems were in place to support families through this time? And then how can we move forward knowing what gaps exist in our communities that need to be?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I was looking forward to this all day today. So I was happy to be here. And yes, unfortunately, we have seen a lot of the things that we already knew. And they have come to light because of COVID-19. And so I want to start off by giving you a kind of a rough estimate, if you will, as of the last numbers that were presented to me back on October the 9th, and they get updated once a month or so. Unfortunately, we see that the inner city has been hit very hard by COVID-19. And so if I give you the example that within the districts 2 to 5, 50% of all of the cases for COVID have come from our districts. If you add District 6 in there, it's up to 60% because they share 10%. And so D4, the area that I represent that you previously represented, it's at about almost 14%. The death rates are almost identical. And so 50% of the city's death rates have happened residents between districts 2 and 5, and at 60% if you add D6. So it's unacceptable that our families are just being hit so hard. And so we're working hard to continue to make pushes for just needed information that needs to go out, and especially if we are getting ready for another unfortunate wave that might be coming. But we've also invested a lot of money into helping and resources, and we were very strategic in how we did it. And we've invested $493.5 million into different pillars to support our families. So anything from digital inclusion, which we know is huge, especially for our students. And we know that there's a lot of grandparents that are raising their grandchildren. And so anything that we can do to support that effort. Emergency housing assistance has taken up a good chunk of the money. About $75 million has been invested in 3 different phases of emergency housing assistance. So a majority of it going to rent. $36.1 million has been invested into rent, and then utilities. So we look at CPS and $2.7 million, $500,000 in SAWS fees, and then internet connection as well. So one of the things that we did is we added access to internet as part of this program, because we knew that a lot of our students could not afford it when they started going home back in March when the city implemented the first stay-at-home orders. So that included some support through some hotspots. Distribution of hotspots. We've been partnering with our school districts, parks as community hubs, working with some of our churches and our community partners to make sure that they have access to internet for our students, and that students feel comfortable going and safely practicing social distancing while being able to do their homework, if you will. And then a part of it has been spent, a good chunk of it has also been spent on the health resources. So about $54.5 million has been invested in going out and talking to our neighbors who might not have access to some sort of a digital connection. And so we were very strategic in reaching out to the folks who might not have heard originally about this thing called COVID and what they could do to prevent and protect themselves from it. We've invested also in some safety kits that are being delivered to our most vulnerable residents. And so we hope to continue working together with our community partners in the distribution of this, but it's critical that we also work with our school districts and with organizations such as Communities in Schools, which, yes, I'm a proud product of. And we have to continue looking at what the social support also that's needed we can help with as far as the city goes. And so it's going to take all of us. It's a team effort. It's a very ambitious goal to be able to protect all of our residents, but we're trying as hard as we can with the help of community partners.
Councilwoman, what I really love about the fact that you're part of this conversation is that we are describing the connectedness of so many different institutions that have to work right. That if this was a symphony, everybody has a part to play. And you pointed out very clearly something that the panelists know, which is that we could have already told you by zip code, by census tract, where those tones and that music and those instruments were off. And so, we certainly know that in affluent communities, those things happen already, and they're just naturally built within those institutions. And in some cases, the work of the city coming together, creating these opportunities, these examples that you've described are so critically important. And it's the putting those pieces together that sometimes is how we describe the work of the site coordinator. So I want to just go a little further with one more question for you, Councilwoman. You've come so far, and you yourself are an example of having grown up in the district and understanding what it's like to sometimes either yourself or neighbors or friends suffer in this silence. But I think after that, you've got a learned experience. There's no doubt that you serve as a role model for CIS students. Can you talk about the role that specific person or CIS site coordinator played in your own school experience?
Sure. Well, absolutely. I love talking about my experience. I had a counselor by the name of Ms. Castaño, and she also was assisted by Ms. Lozano, who, by the way, is still employed at Southwest ISD, where I went, and at the high school where I used to go at Southwest. And so, they were the first to really talk to me about going to college. My counselor, my regular high school counselor, had talked to me about, there's this great, you can go to college. There's this great college, Palo Alto, right down the street, literally, and you can pick up and go there, and in 2 years you'll be finished. And so, but what Ms. Castaño, Ms. Lozano did was actually took me for the first time ever to a college campus. And so they took me to the University of the Incarnate Word. And so I had never stepped foot at Incarnate Word. And so, in fact, I think I had maybe driven past it a couple of times in my life. And so they were the ones that really encouraged me to do something, more than the 2-year path at Palo Alto, which is great and great opportunity. But they said, hey, you know what? You have the opportunity because of your grades to apply for scholarships. And so you can go for a 4-year institution. They're the ones that explained, again, my parents have a 1st and 2nd grade education from Mexico, and they don't speak English. To this day, they don't speak English. And so it was a little bit difficult for them to point me in the right direction because they really didn't understand what the difference was between an associate's or an undergrad or master's. They had no idea what I was doing when I was going to get my PhD in Austin. In fact, I think they thought I kept failing at the other places because I keep going to another school or into another program. And so, so I definitely think that really opened the doors for me to start thinking that I could do it. And so, and that's what students like me, what students like you, when you were a student, we need that, right? We need that added support. We need someone to encourage us and be our mentors. And that's exactly what Communities in Schools does. It reminds people that they have a shot at something better, no matter what your circumstances, no matter what your background is. Everybody has a fair chance, and that's through education. And that's why I love Communities in Schools and the work that we do together, and on behalf of our community and specifically our most vulnerable residents.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And I want to bring in one of these superheroes, because when folks think about, and I've learned this now across the country, when students talk about their relationship with their site coordinator, what they know is Miss Lozano. For me, it was Miss Reyes and Miss Bell, and for many, it's Miss Prudeaux. And we don't really know we're meeting CIS or Communities in Schools or a national nonprofit. We just know there's a caring relationship with an adult describing the experiences that you have. So Jennifer, if I can bring you into this conversation, what I'd like to ask you is that your role has probably had to change a little bit over the last several months, and where we talk about the ways that we are getting students to reach their potential. Sometimes there's even things as day-to-day as reaching their next meal, ensuring that they have a roof over their head. And something that you've been particularly specialized in is working with them to improve their social emotional well-being and engagement. Something that I think many members of our community, certainly I can speak to my own community, we just don't know how to access that level of connection to professionals. And you're bringing that to them, to the schools. So can you talk to me about the changing role that the pandemic has done to your work and how you've adjusted to this new way of life?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you. That's an awesome question to ask. So as a site coordinator at Dory Miller Elementary, we recognize that families' anxiety increased due to basic needs. This is where the importance of collaboration with the school's administration is vital, especially that with the family engagement specialists. Together, we connected families with resources within the community. Our families there at Dory Miller, because of poverty, struggled with providing meals for their children. All the students had received free breakfast, free lunch, and right before dismissal, even a dinner, which included a hamburger, a fruit, and a milk to eat in their classroom, just to get them through the night. And then they also received snack packs for kids every Friday. Our community partner, the Rotary Club of San Antonio, they prepared snack packs with non-perishable items so that students would go home with these items and it will get them through the weekend. So what we experienced is that we had to adjust. How do we adjust with this pandemic to fill those gaps? That included us hosting food drives, connecting families to food mobile pantries. For those that had no transportation, Communities in Schools and campus staff were the ones to deliver those groceries to the doorsteps. Another component that we saw was technology. Many students, families, even staff had to adjust to the new norm overnight. And like Councilwoman said, we have many grandparents that are raising grandchildren, and they're not familiar with this generation's technology. So as site coordinators, we assisted those families in connecting to Hotspot, how to navigate through Zoom or Google Classrooms, setting them up with an email account. And through virtual learning, we continue to adapt. And how are we going to keep these students engaged now? With that being said, social emotional learning was another big adjustment, and it continues to be. How do we keep these students engaged during this pandemic, and especially over a computer or a device? The emotional impact, it really increased sadness, anxiety within the students by not seeing their friends, not having that transition from 5th grade to 6th grade, not being able to celebrate with their teacher at the end of the school year or prom. Therefore, creativity, it was vital. Something that worked for me was a simple game of playing virtual chess with my students. I had students say, Ms. Prudeaux, we needed this virtual group lunch. We needed this virtual chess game. Again, communities and schools, it helps students adjust to that new norm. And it was just by a simple voice of reassurance and engagement to explore those feelings during this pandemic. Moreover, now some students we have back on campus, they're continuing to adapt. So how can we build and re-engage with these students, especially our population there at Dory Miller that may be missing that nurturing component? Students are excited to see us. They want to come and reach for that hug. They want that handshake. So the adjustment is, well, we can't hug, so let's tap our feet together or do a happy dance together. So keep in mind, there's many components that we continue to adjust, but these are the major ones: basic needs, adjustment to technology, and the social emotional impact.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think I just want to lift up again what you've said, which is this concept that SEL, and it's being talked about all across the country, as its digital divide is a huge component that we're learning from this, but also social emotional learning that we take for granted that isn't addressed, especially when we have students who are dealing with toxic stress or trauma that they need to grapple with before they can be present in their math class, in their English class. And the social emotional learning is something that's sort of unique and special to the CIS model, and something that we're now sort of getting better at doing outside the classroom in a hybrid version. But the best is always that one-on-one that sometimes families can work on in creating connections and relationships around self-control, self-awareness, and interpersonal skills. So thank you, Jennifer, for speaking to that. And somebody who I think knows a lot about this, I want to introduce Pedro into the conversation. I think, Pedro, as I've gotten to know you, I've gotten to know your work, and I've gotten to hear your vision for SAISD, a lot of what you've described is well ahead of, I think, the pandemic, in that now more folks are talking about a lot of those non-academic needs that need to be true so that our teachers can teach and have the complete focus of a student's attention. So all of those non-academic factors, can you tell me now, with school buildings that were previously closed, resources being limited, how did SAISD grapple with this and maybe leverage community partnerships to continue the resources that families need?
Well, thank you again for having me, and I just love hearing Dr. Garcia and as Ms. Prudeaux. I mean, just not only are they both champions, but just examples of what's possible, right? And how people are stepping up during this period. And I'll tell you, Ray, for me, one of the things that I love about our community, I've always said this, since I've been here, this is my 6th year, this community has a way of collaborating, of working together, getting sort of, not getting caught up in egos and other things that get in the way in other cities. And whenever something hits us, it unites us even more. It unites us to really work together. And so, for example, we partnered with the city and the county, and both have been amazing partners in working with us on supporting our children. We knew before this pandemic, for example, on the west side, 780-207, that District 5, that we had neighborhoods where 70%, 70, of the families did not have access to internet, did not have access to devices. We had a grant from Spring 1 Million where we were able to give each of our high school students either a cell phone or data plan. And that was all they needed was to answer a quick survey of, do you have a device? Do you have a data plan? Yes or no, that was it. And it was every high school student in our district. This happened before COVID. At Lanier High School, 70% of our children had to get a device or a cell phone plan or a cell phone. And so for us, it just showed us the need. That was before the pandemic. After the pandemic, we were able to distribute 40,000 devices on an enrollment base of 48,000. There's no district in the country that's had to distribute that kind of percentage of devices to their student population. And then of course, we've served over 2 million meals since the spring break all the way up to when school started. And so for us, as you said, Rey, what I can't help but feel this is that here in San Antonio, we've been working together to deal with these inequities. And we're showing progress, and it is a united effort. It is the city, it is the county, it is our district, it is communities and schools, it is all of our partners. The pandemic, what it's done is just elevated it to even a more urgent level, because the one thing that I really worry about is this pandemic is one of the, what's happening right now is one of the cruelest events that I've ever seen, because for professionals, for the most part, they have their jobs. It's inconvenient for them, right? Because they either can't travel, they can't socialize the way they'd like to. There's an inconvenience, right? And of course, I'm thankful to all of our families who are supporting us with their children learning remote. But again, as long as they're professionals, they have their jobs, they have their income. Our families who already were living in poverty, well, many of them lost their jobs. Many of them lost hours. Many of them didn't have benefits. They didn't have health insurance. So all this pandemic did is just made their condition even worse. And so for me, I just think it's important for us to always make sure we know that. And what I love is that, our teachers, our partners, we're working to make sure that, yes, academics, we want to make sure, because we know that, and Rey, you and I have talked about this, education is the equalizer in our society. Everything else helps, but education is the only thing that really can help families get out of poverty. And we really believe that. Our teachers know that and believe that, but at the same time, we also know that our children are going through so much stress. Our families are going through so much stress and so many things that they can't control. And so, I just love it. I'm very proud of the work we're doing. Our board has been a strong leader. And so again, for us, I just look forward to continue to work with our community, because I know we're going to come out of this and we're going to come out stronger.
Thank you for just elevating the theme of unity, and especially now that I get the opportunity to take a look at places, San Antonio is unique in its challenges. And I say that comparing it to, an Atlanta or a Charlotte that similar to San Antonio have issues of income segregation and inequality. But I think it's this unique factor of folks coming together that I have seen and been particularly proud of in San Antonio that allows us to really just move forward without thinking about who gets the credit. And so let me ask you a separate question here, Pedro, because it gets back to this basic architecture of public schools living up to their promise and us getting to a level and equal playing field. Can you talk about how the pandemic highlighted, and you discussed this, the need for significant investment in our buildings and in our technology?
Rey, I can't help but, when I think of all of our efforts and initiatives, I think of the irony, right? So for example, here in South Texas, there's now documentaries that you can look at in Netflix about how our language and our culture was never supported, right? So for our Latinx community, it was never supported. Of course, our African-American community has never been supported. And when I think about the fact that in our district, more than half of the schools now have dual language programs, and parents are talking to us, it's so ironic, Superintendent, that in this particular school, I was discouraged from speaking Spanish. And I want to build to that, to the buildings, because I think it's all connected. And then when I look at the age of our buildings, right? We have buildings that are over 100 years old. They were disinvested in. And by the way, our buildings are clean, they're well maintained. Our custodial staff, every time I go to any of our schools, I always say, this is like God's work, right? Like they take care of those buildings like if they're their own children. I mean, they really do. But yet they show their age. They show the lack of technology in the classrooms. And so for me, it's all connected, right, to this persistence of inequity and really, bias towards our culture and our families that has existed in South Texas, for a long time. And so here now we have the nerve to, maybe the nerve for some people, maybe the guts of others, to go to our community and ask for a $1.3 billion set of bond questions, the largest ever, larger than any of our suburban peers have ever asked for, larger than the county or city, because we said, you know what, basta, that's it. This is time now for people to either walk the talk or because these inequities have existed for decades. And my board, has led that charge with our Blue Ribbon Task Force. Our community is with us. I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, I'm on pins and needles waiting for next Tuesday. But I'll tell you, as I've talked to our community, the pride that exists in terms of the way we've handled the pandemic, our academic success, having the largest achievement gains of any district in Texas in 2019. That was the last year of testing. We've closed the gap on college going rates with our county and state. And so as I speak, Maria Garcia is at MIT, my first MIT going student, that she's there now. We got her a full Quest scholarship, right? One of 10 in the country. But I also have students at UTSA and UT Austin and College Station and the like. And now we have some amazing partnerships like with Trinity, where our students going forward, if they're accepted, their full need will be met at Trinity University. So for me, Ray, when I look at all these things collectively together, I feel that there's a movement here. There's a movement here in San Antonio. It is with all of our partners. It's with communities and schools and the city, the county. They're all with us. And so that gives me a lot of hope that, that not only are we going to, get through this pandemic, but we're going to show everybody what it takes to start dealing with these huge systemic inequities and not just talking about it, but actually doing something about it.
Thank you, Pedro. And I want to ask the panelists if they'll stick around, because we're going to have Q&A in a few minutes here. And I want to introduce somebody else to the conversation who I think for a long time has been walking the talk and understands what it means to try to get back to a new normal that isn't just let's go back to the way things have always been. Diego Bernal, who is a state representative. I'm just going to give a quick bio, which is, I think you should know the most important pieces about his bio. Tafoya Middle School, Jefferson grad, attended the University of Michigan. Then I really like this piece. Also, came back and went to work in Harlingen, Texas, where he was working at communities and schools at the time. But for many of you all know, the way I got to know Diego was as a city councilman, where he and I served. He's now state representative for District 120. Let me make sure I got this right. We're in 123. And Diego, I want to bring you into this conversation because the last legislative session had been so much of a discussion around the emphasis of public education. I think most folks were feeling like things are clicking. They get it at the state level. Speaking to Pedro's point around the unification that at the state level, the city level, the local school district level, the classroom level, folks really wanted to get behind this question of how do we address the needs of our students, especially those living in high density poverty. How are we addressing it in our classrooms? And then, like, watch out, here comes a curveball out of nowhere. And then you've got COVID and all of the additional burdens on top of school districts, not the least of which is all the extra costs to making sure that we're keeping students safe. So I think for the panel, we're curious, like heading into the next legislative session, like what do you foresee as the challenges to maintain this ongoing momentum that was built, increased investment in education, and what can we do as a community to support you and ensure students continue to receive the resources that they just desperately need?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ray, so much. I'm so happy to be here and to hear from you and Jessica and Jennifer and Adriana and Pedro, all heroes of mine that do work that I believe in. And I think Pedro's last comments are a great jumping off point for the approach both to the legislative session, but also what I think we should do at home. I'm going to break it up into those two pieces. The legislative session is going to be hard because I don't care what anyone says, we're going to have a tremendous deficit. Not too long ago, the comptroller came and said that we're looking at a $4.5 to $5 billion hole. The problem with those numbers is that the assumptions made in calculating them is that 2021 was going to look just like 2019. And I think as the new year approaches, we can all sort of reconcile with the fact that that's not going to be the case. So we have to do a couple of things. One is we have to draw a halo around public education funding to make sure that there are no cuts. There might be some delays, but that's just as frustrating because the important parts of HB3 that affect the kinds of kids that we're talking about right now weren't going to happen until the second year anyway, this school year. So the increased spectrum weight for poverty wasn't going to be deployed until this year. The teacher incentive wasn't going to happen until this year. A lot of the pre-K money wasn't going to come until this year and the year after. And so it's not just protecting what we've got, but we never even got a chance to see the real big pieces of HB3 work in the classroom because the pandemic interrupted it. We never even got to get started. So here we are with a false start, a tremendous hole, and then we're going to have a conversation, I think, about revenue. Now, revenue for the state generally, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a academic or an educational conversation, but I do believe that educators and the world of education has to be involved with it because they're going to benefit from it. And then from that point, it lends itself to all of the other external factors that affect education, right? Like healthcare. Texas has been remiss to expand Medicaid, and if we were to do that, that's about $5.5 billion alone in money that would come into the state. For budget purposes alone, much less the health benefits, it makes sense. So the legislative session is going to be quite a bit about money and saving and protecting things and finding a way to do that so we can sort of live to fight another day. But that also reminds me of what I think we should mention locally, and it lends itself perfectly to what Pedro and others were saying, and that is that we are a city with challenges. And a big part of HB3 and a big part of the work that CIS does is acknowledging the role that poverty plays, the negative effects that poverty plays in the education of our kids, right? And so public education policy and CIS itself is almost designed to push back and keep those forces at bay, right? So that you create sort of a safe space, a bubble, a membrane that students can exist in to withstand it. But, you know, San Antonio leads the nation in the number of families living below the federal poverty line. San Antonio leads the nation in the number of children living below the federal poverty line. San Antonio leads the nation in the number of poor children, not number, percent, I'm sorry, of young children, which is 0 to 5, living below the federal poverty line. And so at a certain point, it can't just be that we only focus on schools to fortify them from the forces of poverty. I think as a city, we have to have a reckoning with who and what we are and where we are, and decide that we have to very deliberately attack poverty itself. It can't just be that we try to keep poverty at bay, but if you want to give the students and the schools a fighting chance to achieve their dreams and to recognize their full potential, we also have to spend time and probably money deliberately attacking that poverty itself, right? And the reason I say deliberately, I'll finish this rant and then I'll stop. But the reason I say deliberately is because the traditional things that people say you're supposed to do to deal with poverty, we've actually done, and it didn't have the effect that we thought it would. So just put on your researcher hat for a minute, right? The decade of 2008 to 2018. Okay, San Antonio is top five in the nation in job creation. We are top 5 in the nation at wage increases, and we are top 5 in the nation, top 5 in what's called gross metropolitan products, like GDP for a city. So at the same time that we achieve these top 5 heights is the exact same decade where we rose to number 1 on those other 3 indicators: poverty, child poverty, and young child poverty. In other words, these things didn't translate into better outcomes here. The only way then to deal with these things is to do it deliberately, for us as a community to decide that we are going to deliberately attack poverty and deliberately try to dismantle it, deliberately try to change the systems and do it at scale, because otherwise we're going to stay where we're at. And it's going to put more burdens on educators, on schools, on CIS, because they can't do it all themselves. This sort of Atlas model of education doing it all is unfair, right? Because as you know, and all of the people who work at CIS know, all of our kids are talented. It's just an opportunity gap that exists. The opportunity gaps exist in the world of education and outside. And so I think that as a legislature and as a city, we have to recognize that we have to fortify, fund, and support public education, but also in that support means going after the things that make that educational experience so challenging, that make that job so challenging, and doing it at once. Because if we don't go after poverty, if we don't attack poverty, then we are going to have this conversation over and over again. And it's going to take the superheroics of people like you and Jessica and Jennifer and Adriana and Pedro over and over again. And I just think that the conversation has to broaden, because where we find ourselves at a city, where there's nowhere left to go. We're already at the top. There's no one below us in the major metros. We leapfrog Detroit. So I think that the work is cut out for us, as Pedro said, not just as educators, but as an entire community. And I think that's the next frontier for us.
Thank you, Diego. I think a representative, what you've done is just help us kind of zoom out, because what we sometimes end up doing is we sort of zoom into one institution, the city, the state, the school district, the classroom, the teacher, and say, here is the easy button. And so what I think happens when we fall into that trap, and I'm going to get into one question that I think we have time for. So I'm going to invite the panel back to help us answer this question that I want to pull up, because I've certainly been hearing a lot about, and perhaps Pedro, but also the Councilwoman, you can discuss this. When we get into this easy button opportunity, what happens is it's easy to brush some folks or some communities into the darkness of they can suffer and nobody will ever pay attention and know. And so one of the questions was about, what do we do about these students, since we'll stay within the confines of the school, who just are not showing up? Because I say that because there are so many reasons for why they're not logging on, or why they're not showing up on anyone's list, that gets to this question of all of those components that are putting pressure on them before they even show up as a, hey, this student didn't show up to virtual learning.
So here's what and I think it's a great question, Ray, because here's what I'm seeing, and I want us to, really understand this. I have the ability through my networks and just all the different relationships I have nationwide to see what's happening across the country. And what I'm seeing, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Denver, Philly, Baltimore, pick a city, of course, here in San Antonio, is that our children, there's significant academic challenges for our children that are happening across the country. And it's very disproportionate to our children living in poverty. So, and that's in spite of the hard work of our teachers. This is not about, our teachers not working hard. Trust me, I have teachers right now that I'm worried about burning out because they're working till midnight. They're contacting students, parents. I'm pretty sure, Jennifer, you're seeing the same thing, even with all of our different, amazing communities and schools, coordinators. Everybody's working really hard. But Ray, the reality is that remote learning, our districts were never, and our households were never set up for success. They never were. The only districts that I see that I have success with remote learning are ones that were doing it well before the pandemic, private schools who were doing flipped classrooms, residential schools, private schools that were the very elitist schools. They were already doing these strategies. There was never an issue of devices. There was never an issue about technology. Supports at home were not an issue. Living conditions were not an issue. That's a very small population in our country, especially when it comes to children of color. And so what I'm seeing, Ray, is that, and as I'm talking to my colleagues across the country, one of the things that I'm really looking at is, sharing with them is, okay, we got to develop long-term academic plans. So we definitely, I'm not going to give up on our children. So we're already working on how we refine our academic plans this school year. For any, and I have a lot of children that are struggling, but the one thing I can say is that our district is holding its own. We're not seeing, when I look at districts across the country, across the state, we're not seeing any bigger losses in our district than anywhere else. And I really, it's a testament to my teachers, even though my children, even though they're much lower income, right? But I always say they're rich in potential, they're rich in perseverance. And so we're not seeing that, but what I'm seeing as a whole, for the whole nation, Diego, and for the whole state, by the way, even our suburban peers are seeing the same thing, significant academic loss. And so again, I think this is something where as a nation, we're gonna have to grapple with this. As a state, we have to grapple with this because 60% of our population in Texas, as Diego and I always talk about, are free and reduced lunch children. In addition to that, we have the largest K-12 population of the country. We're bigger than California. And so it just means that, what happens in Texas is also has a significant impact on our nation.
And I'd like to just piggyback off of that. And I think that it continues to work together is the key, right? And so a couple of weeks ago, I was reached out by one of my principals. And so I try to keep in regular contact without trying to be too much in their hair, just to see how I could be supportive. And I probably connect with the superintendents in our district at least once a week. And so, or with someone in their admin, just to see what's going on at the start of the pandemic. How can we help? How can we make sure children continue to be fed? How can we ensure that they keep attending and learning, et cetera? And so we were reached out a couple of weeks ago by one of the principals that was concerned about the students that weren't coming in because they had to work, and they were working additional hours now because they were trying to support their families because their parents had lost jobs. And then some of them were even helping their parents with small business, if you will, right? And so, so one kid was out literally picking up some plumbing stuff for his dad, and during the time that he should have been learning. And so I brought in some of the state reps in our area to the conversation, and I asked, oh, what can we do? I brought in our school board of educators representative, Marisa Perez, who, well, sorry, I always forget her new last name, Diaz, but she, you know, we were working together to figure out what is it, how can we push a message. I'm meeting with the superintendent of Southwest ISD next week. I'd hope to engage, maybe go public, just remind people that these kids still need to learn, and we can't afford for them to fall behind because they're already behind, unfortunately, right? And so just continuing the conversation and learning from the people who actually are in the classrooms or in virtual classrooms every single day is critical. I don't know what I don't know. So my job, my responsibility is to go ask and make sure that I ask the right people. So I'm asking teachers, I'm asking principals, I'm asking superintendents to work with us so that we could solve a problem that perhaps we weren't aware about. And so I think it's going to be critical to continue to engage with communities and schools and our superintendents and our teachers and principals.
Yeah, and just to jump on that too, as a site coordinator, we're seeing this, you know, firsthand. This is something that we're already exposed to. You know, one of my good friends and the family engagement specialist at Dory Miller said that our children are coming with heavy backpacks already. So we've seen this firsthand already. We've been preparing for something like this as site coordinators, and we continue to do so. Yes, it's a lot of work, but this is what we do. We see it firsthand. So I believe that, you know, it really does take a community to get involved and raise a child. And that's what we're doing. We're making those home visits to see why aren't the students engaged, making those phone calls, leaving those letters at doorsteps to say like, hey, we stopped by, you didn't answer, but we'd love to see you back on campus. We'd love to see you back virtually learning. So we are reaching out to them. It is going to be challenging just based on the economics here in San Antonio.
So I've got 1 minute I want to give to you, Diego, to sort of finish up here, and it's a thought, which is that what do we take from the last 8 months? Like, there is a lesson to be learned here. It's sometimes, I think, a big threat where we forget the moment of which the crisis existed and the fire that we felt to want to do something. So what is the takeaway for you on this?
I think the takeaway that there's really no such thing as going back, because as everyone on the screen will tell you, to go back is to start with those pre-existing problems again. I think that, and not to be crass about it, but I think we have to find opportunity where it is to come out of this and be better and forward-looking. Part of that, I think, is allowing ourselves and our community and our families deserve this. We have to be honest about where we're at and where we need to go. It's one of the things I admire so much about Pedro, about you, Pedro, is that he is unabashedly honest about what he sees, what's happening, what needs to be fixed. We can't sugarcoat where we're at. We have to have a fire in our belly, not just to recover, but then to improve, right? And so what I think the takeaway for me is, how do we take what we've learned, what has been laid bare, right, from this circumstance and fix it so it's not going back. It's just it's a new, better day coming out of this, right? That somehow this has been sort of a rejuvenating, sad and tragic, but springboard to a better future for those kids and for the entire community. I think that we just can't go back. It's got to be different.
Thank you, Diego. And I want to now thank the entire panel for this rich discussion, this honesty, this candidness about what it's like going forward, how hard this is going to be, and being very honest about that piece. So thank you again to our panel. With the last minute or two here, what I'd like to do is actually invite somebody to the conversation, and her name is Margaret Shellenberg. Margaret is going to tell us a little bit more about the group called Friends of CIS. There's a logo here. Margaret, why don't you go ahead and walk us through?
Oh, well, thank you, Ray. As chair of Friends of Communities and Schools San Antonio and co-host of today's event, I would like to thank our panelists and moderator for their excellent presentation. I think I speak for all of us when I say you really inspired us and exceeded all of our expectations. This is our 5th annual Ed Talk, and it will be memorable not only for being a virtual event, but also for what we learned here today. The good news is that the city, school districts, and CIS are in, like kind of what you said, Ray, a symphony, a partnership that is reaching out to every student possible to ensure that they're able to participate in school, even in this pandemic time. And for those most vulnerable students, that they receive the attention that a caring relationship can provide to make a difference for them to be in school and thrive. But as all of our panelists, as Diego has reminded us, there's still work to do. In 2009, a group of friends responded to a call to action, writing in a newspaper article, "San Antonio a dropout factory? Not on our watch." Since then, Friends of CIS has organized to let the community know about the great work that CIS does in our schools, in our city, and in our nation. Before you leave today, I invite you to sign up to learn more about CIS or become a friend. I invite you to help us provide additional opportunities for students by supporting our enrichment activities like museum tours, art workshops at the Mackney Art Museum and San Antonio Museum of Art, or environmental programming at the San Antonio Botanical Garden for students to explore nature and to learn about healthy eating. So we ask you to join us today in our efforts to support CIS and all of us to share a vision that you've proposed today, as together we work to end racial and inequitable barriers and ensure that all students are able to succeed in our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for leading the efforts, leading the work of Friends of CIS. And to our virtual guests, I want to say thank you for joining this conversation. Let me be the 86th person to remind you that we're also in the middle of an election season. We at CIS believe it's important that, especially for the students that we serve and the families of those students, to recognize what power they have and to not let that power get away from them by letting this election the opportunity to register their voice and their vote to happen as well. So make sure to remind your friends. Of course, if you want to know more about CIS, we hope you will follow us on our social media sites and stay engaged and stay connected. As many of our panelists said, it is one thing to talk about how bad the flooding is when it's raining, but when the sun comes up and is shining and has dried up all that rain, can we still have that fire in our bellies to have the conviction and the discipline to talk about what needs to happen and what needs to change, whether that's in our public schools, social and racial inequities that need to be addressed at every level. And so with that, we send you off in the spirit of conviction and principle for the communities that we care about and the unity that this city brings together. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. We are adjourned.